Hello, Potomac Crossing Ward. We are on lesson 40 to 2020 CFM lesson 40, 3rd Nephi 20 through 26. So this covers the second day, or most of the second day. Chapter 19 covers the beginning of the second day when Jesus passes the sacrament and prays with and for the Lehites at the temple. But 20 through 26 covers the majority of the rest of that day, where he lectures them on the redemption of Israel and the role of the Gentiles in that. So that's what we're going to be talking about with this lesson. And then at the end, I'm going to just kind of talk about the LDS position on this subject versus the general Christian subject on that, and that's not going to be in my lesson notes. I'm reading off my notes for the bulk of the material for the lesson, but the stuff at the end is just me kind of talking at random. So if you don't want to listen to my extemporaneous conversation about the difference between the LDS Church and the rest of Christianity when it comes to the role of Gentiles in the church, then you can just stop listening. Okay, so general comments on 3rd Nephi 20 through 26. These chapters are a continuation of the redemption of Israel theme mentioned in 15:5 through 8 and discussed in chapter 16. In chapter 20, Jesus discusses the role of the Gentiles. We see that in 20:10 through 28. And the fulfillment of various Old Testament prophecies concerning the gathering of Israel. We see that in 20:29 through 46. In chapter 21, Jesus gives the sign of the start of the gathering of Israel, which we see in 21:1 through 7, and ties it to the determining factor on which of the Gentiles and which of Israel are gathered in and which are cast off and destroyed, which we see in 21:8 through 29. Jesus quotes from Isaiah and Malachi and comments considerably on the text. The chapters rely heavily on the rhetorical style of the Old Testament prophets, particularly Isaiah. Familiarity with Old Testament prophetic writings, the rhetoric associated with them and the language and all that, will aid in understanding the present text. The core message is found in 21:3 through 5. Namely, that the gospel should come to the Gentiles first, so that it would be carried to the remnants of Israel who had fallen into disbelief because of sin. And since the remnants of Israel are scattered among the Gentiles, taking the gospel to the Gentiles makes it possible to introduce the gospel to scattered Israel, who is scattered among the Gentiles. Okay, so comments on 3rd Nephi chapter 20. In reading this chapter, we cannot take the events described herein as occurring sequentially or as a linear series of historical events. Reading it as though verses 10 through 19 happens, and then verses 20 through 28 happens, and then verses 29 through 46 happens, leaves the reader terribly confused, as they really are all talking about the same single event. What each portion does is address the same event from a different viewpoint to emphasize a specific point, each section addressing that different point. Verses 10 through 19 emphasize that Israel will be gathered and made the Lord's people, and the Gentiles will be under Israel's heel, a reversal of Israel's general history. Verses 20 through 28 then expound upon this theme to emphasize this reversal is because Israel is the Lord's covenant people, where the Gentiles have no covenant. And verses 29 through 46 emphasize that Israel's return to the Lord will be when the remnants receive the fullness of the gospel and accept Christ. All three sections address the gathering of Israel, each emphasizing a particular point thereof. So, again, this is three different versions, three different point of views of the same thing. So don't read this as A, then B, then C. All three versions are of the same thing, just from a different point of view. Okay. 3 Nephi 21. In this chapter, Jesus focuses mainly on the role of the Gentiles in the restoration of Israel, which we see in verses 1 through 10. The reaction of the Gentiles will have to that role. Some will reject him, which we see in verses 11 through 21. And some will accept him and assist in the gathering of Israel, which we see in verses 22 through 29. Comments on 3 Nephi 22. Here, Jesus quotes Isaiah 54 to continue the theme of chapters 20 through 21. This chapter of Isaiah deals with the redemption of Israel despite the Lord's anger at their intransigence, which we see in verses 1 through 14, and the fate of those who persecuted Israel, which we see in verses 15 through 17. Detailed comments on this chapter of Isaiah can be seen in my comments on Isaiah. I don't comment on this chapter in my Book of Mormon comments because this is just a quote of Isaiah 54. So if you want to dig into this chapter, look at my comments on Isaiah 54. Comments on 3 Nephi 23. In this chapter, Jesus continues teaching the people, which we see in verse 14. He specifically endorses the writings of the prophet Isaiah in verses 1 through 5. And then he has them correct an omission, which we see in verses 6 through 13. So the omission here is Samuel's prediction of the dead, the resurrected dead appearing to the people of Nephi. So in that case, the prophecy of Samuel the entire prophecy of Samuel was not omitted. Like his warnings and the predictions of the night, the sun, light during the night at Christ's birth, and then 3 days of darkness at Christ's death. This simply just appears to be an omission of one particular point, which Christ wanted them to include. It's not an egregious omission of all of Samuel's prophecies. There's nothing to suggest that's the case. Okay, so and then 3 Nephi 24 through 25. These two chapters relate the words of God given to Malachi. The general message of the book of Malachi is that Israel has apostatized, which we see in 24, which is Malachi chapter 3. So the Lord will have to punish and purify them, so the righteous remnant can inherit the covenant blessings of their fathers, which we see in chapter 25, which is Malachi chapter 4. And again, detailed comments on Malachi 3 and 4 can be seen on my comments on Malachi. And then comments on 3 Nephi 26. This chapter concludes Jesus' second day of his teaching the Lehites, which we see in verses 1 through 5. Mormon makes some comments on the material he selectively edited in 6 through 13. So the preceding chapters where we have Christ talking, Mormon is including that text as a straight-up verbatim quotation from what apparently from the large plates. So from verse 6 on, Mormon starts abridging the content again. It's no longer verbatim quotes. So Mormon takes over again as editing from verse 6. So 6 through 13, Mormon makes some comments and includes the final events of the second day in verses 14 through 15. He briefly mentions some events of the third day of Jesus' visit in verse 16. And then he informs us concerning the start of the church among the Lehites in verses 17 through 21. So this chunk of text largely deals with Christ's second day visit among the Lehites. And then, again, it deals largely with the relationship between scattered Israel and the Gentiles. Now, for the church, for the members, we're Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, we have a very different view when it comes to the role of the Gentiles and scattered Israel. We have it and a lot of this has to do with the temple and vicarious ordinance work and the way that this is pulled into the church. And like, because of these chapters, as well as quite a bit of content inside in the Doctrine and Covenants, right? It talks a lot about the redemption and recovery of natural Israel. So for us inside the church, this is something that we get very plainly, and we understand our connection to them because of the vicarious ordinance work and the necessity of missionary work. And for us, this all seems very intuitively obvious. But for Christendom in general, and I'm speaking, just like pretty much everybody else, they don't really get it. They see Christ's actions as being like the end of the Old Testament and the beginning of the New Testament. And when in the New Testament you have Paul arguing against the law, telling them that the law is over and done and that Gentiles are adopted in, Christendom in general just sees like Israel's role is pretty much done and over with, and the gospel is now to everybody, and what Christ did now opens it up to everybody, and they really don't see or focus on the redemption of Israel at all. This is something the Book of Mormon focuses on very squarely, but the New Testament doesn't really spend a lot of time on, because early in the church, Paul is in a great deal of conflict with Judaizers, and he's arguing against Judaism and the maintaining of the law. So where Paul is trying to separate the Christian church from the law of Moses and the trappings of the law of Moses, and we even see this in the Book of Mormon, right? When Jesus appears, the resurrected Christ appears to the Lehites at the temple, they're there to observe the Passover. And then they're asking him, they're like, what do we do with the law? I mean, what's the story? And then Jesus goes in and he spends pretty much the first day talking about how to organize the church and baptism and how to manage affairs internally and how to pray and how to do the sacrament. He is organizing at that point the church and how to run the church in the absence of the law of Moses. So the New Testament church is very much caught up in the same sort of problem of letting go of the law of Moses and moving into the Christian era. But a lot of the result of that is the Christian church has lost track of the connection of Israel and scattered Israel and the redemption of Israel. Now, the exception to that would be some evangelical churches and evangelical Christians and some Messianic Christians or Jews who've converted to Christianity. So that's like Messianic Christians. They very much focus on Israel, meaning the state, the nation of Israel, and like around Jerusalem, over there in the Middle East. When we talk about Israel, that's what they're talking about, and that's what they focus on. And their perspective on that is very closely tied to events of John's Revelation, the Apocalypse, the predictions about the temple at Jerusalem, temple worship being restored, and all of the stuff about the two prophets testifying in the last day, and this conflict with Gog and Magog, and the beast, and the two beasts, and the great harlot. So they have this very apocalyptic sort of view. And the Christian view of that is really a very kind of selfish, kind of egocentric view, because they see this as the second coming being tied to the reestablishment of the temple at Jerusalem. So for these evangelical Christians and Messianic Christians, they see it as, restoration of the nation of Israel, the country, and the rebuilding of the temple. They see this as like necessary and ushering in the second coming, and something that needs to happen. So for the bulk of Christianity, they just kind of miss the whole thing about redemption of Israel. And like these chapters of Isaiah that Jesus quotes here, and all of the other Old Testament prophecies about the restoration of Israel, the Malachi chapters, and all of the other ones too. I mean, the other prophets all reference this kind of stuff. Christianity just kind of misses it, and they just kind of are like, yeah, whatever. And then those who don't are very focused on this kind of apocalyptic confrontation sort of thing. Focusing on the second coming and precipitating those events where there's the conflict, and where Christ then appears and causes the earthquake and splits the temple, and then the waters rush out and all that kind of stuff. So for the LDS audience, our view is much different on this subject than it is for Christendom in general. We believe in the second coming. We see this as something that's happening, but we tend to de-emphasize the apocalyptic kind of stuff, where some of the other evangelical Christians and other churches and stuff kind of make it more of a big deal and are more focused on that. We see this as a much more holistic effort that's tied into our temple worship and tied into missionary work, where as we go out through the world and we preach the gospel to everybody in all nations, that inevitably some of the people that we bring in through missionary work are going to be some of the lineage of Israel scattered wherever they are among whatever nations. If you baptize people out of every nation, you're probably going to bring in some natural Israel with those people out of the nations that you baptize. Okay, then one last thing I want to mention, in these chapters 20 through 26, it's talking about the role of the Gentiles in bringing natural Israel back in. And Christ is saying, the Gentiles who accept the gospel, they'll be considered part of Israel, and the Gentiles who don't, they'll be rejected. So that's talking about us. I mean, the bulk of the church today is very likely composed of people who are adopted into Israel. We are not natural. We are probably not. I'm probably not natural Israel. My genealogy comes from Germany, and on my dad's side, and England and Ireland on my mom's side. So chances are I'm not natural Israel. I'm probably a Gentile, and I'm here by adoption, which is fine. But we need to remember that we are largely Gentiles, and as we go out and we're doing this work, that we're the fortunate ones who are adopted in. And by virtue of being sealed, you become born into the covenant. You're in that role of natural Israel by being sealed together as a family, and then your children are protected, the same as though you were Israel. That's the promise of being born in the covenant, or the protection of being born in the covenant. I mean, that's something that we don't really explain very well inside the church. Of the promise of having your family sealed is the promise of having your children who are protected under that sealing as being protected the same as natural Israel, where if your children go astray, the Lord will work on them and attempt to recover your children the same as though they were natural Israel, the natural children of Abraham. So that's a really big, important promise that I don't think we really understand very well as a church. Sometimes we talk about like born in the covenant, that kind of thing. We reference it, and I don't think we really get it. That the promise of sealing, of being born in the covenant, or the promise of having your parents sealed, is the promise of the Lord never giving up on your family, your lineage, your children, and then He will always try to recover them and bring them back in, the same as He would the natural children of Abraham, because he keeps track of all that. That's what all this genealogy is, all this temple work, all this vicarious ordinance work. All of that is tracking the children of Abraham and who is and who isn't, and collecting all of those people to fulfill that covenant. Welding those links and making all those connections. That's really what this is all about. And that's what these chapters are talking about when we're talking in 3 Nephi 20 through 26. This is Christ emphasizing that when he makes a covenant, it doesn't just get ignored and blown off. That's what Isaiah, these chapters in Isaiah that Christ quotes. He's saying, look, this is a done deal. It's happening. As far as I'm concerned, the covenant has been made, and I'm going to keep it no matter what. And I will do what it takes to keep that covenant. So when it talks about the Gentiles coming along and being part of that, this is an opportunity. This is I wouldn't say a free ride for the Gentiles, but this is an opportunity for the Gentiles to be included where otherwise we would have been excluded. He's basically saying this is an opportunity for the Gentiles to be included, the same as would have Abraham's own natural children. So that's what these chapters are about, and that's kind of our position, our kind of unique position in Christianity. I haven't seen any of this really in the Roman Catholic Church. General Protestant churches don't really get it. It's more of the kind of evangelicals and the Messianic Judaism who kind of sense that. But again, it's an apocalyptic sort of viewpoint. I have never read anything by any other church that really gets the relationship between the purpose of Christ's mortal ministry and fulfilling the promises in the covenant to Israel, and the way it's all rolling out, and the connection to John's revelation. I've never read any commentary. I've never read any or spoken with anybody or heard anything where people really get that outside of the LDS Church. And I would attribute that to these chapters here in 20 through 26, where Christ explains this very plainly. He very plainly says, "This is the deal, guys," and you know that the covenant is starting to be restored when these words come to you in the form of the Book of Mormon. When the Book of Mormon is published and released and starts being preached and brought to the world, this is the beginning of the fulfillment of this covenant. So when these words come to you, you know that it's started. So that's what's happening in these chapters. And again, it gets picked up in Doctrine and Covenants as well. The various revelations talking about that sort of thing. But that's what these chapters are talking about. All right, and we will have more next week.